Right. Well, I made that 7 o'clock. Hopefully, you all agree. So, good evening, welcome, and thank you for coming tonight on what has been a sort of interesting weather-wise day and holidays. So, it's lovely to see such a good turnout tonight. Tonight, we have a talk from one of my fellow directors, Gareth Davies, who's the executive chair of. Is that right? Well, he runs the Secretariat Group anyway. And it's going to talk about the economics of moving Orkney to net zero. So we're really very much looking forward to hearing that, Gareth. And the floor is yours. And welcome to Speak Online.
Thank you, Mark. And I should also point out that I'm going to be followed up by Laura Hutton, who's director of ICNZ, who's going to be talking a bit more about that project and bringing people up to date on where we've got with that. So one of the things we haven't been able to get away from in the last few months is the question of energy and the price of energy. And as we know in Orkney, that's something that's dear to our hearts because we pay a lot for it and we use a lot of it. And in the last few months, there's been a few times where we've talked about the issues of cost and how we might deal with that. And so Neil had asked whether I could put this together and have a look at this as we kind of set our path towards net zero and think about how we might achieve that financially. So there's obviously technical parts to it, there's behavioral parts to it, there's generation, there's demand, but all of that needs money. So just to give context to anybody that's not been in Orkney, maybe visiting on holiday, or if you're new to OREF, Orkney is an incredible archipelago in terms of energy. We've got about 22,000 people. We've got a lot of history around using a lot of energy and then thinking about ways in which we could harness the wind, first of all, and then the waves and the tides. And latterly, because of the problems with the grid and access to the grid, we've got quite heavily involved in storage and how the energy might be transferred into other modes. And on the back of that, we started thinking about how can we use energy within our integrated energy system. So not just thinking about electricity as electricity and fuel as fuel and boats as boats and cars as cars and houses as houses, but thinking about all of those things as linked together and how they can join together and perhaps be more efficient because of that. And as well as that internal focus that we've got as islanders, we've also been projected into the center of one of the biggest industrial investment activities probably undertaken anywhere in the world, around the ScotWind and Intog round. And as we'll see, that's going to inject a huge amount of investment into the waters around Orkney, Hutton, the Western Isles and Aberdeen over the next 20 years. So what does that mean for us? So what I was going to do is just look at the experience to date and the transition action plan that some of you have been at meetings discussing recently. Orkney today and how it's like the UK of tomorrow, and then looking at how our energy system provides insights into some of the challenges that obviously we're going to face, but also other parts of the UK. And therefore, by sharing that, how we can provide value and benefits to other people. So one of the things that we live with is a set of opportunities that are associated with our energy system. And it's a bit like playing snakes and ladders. So there's upsides, but there's also downsides. So in terms of the amount of energy we need and the resources that we've got to match them, we're really well blessed with renewables. And we've got an engaged community, which is represented here tonight in the OREF audience. Got a highly progressive supply chain, probably 30 companies involved in delivering sustainable energy within the islands. And there's a track record of delivery over the last now 23 years and more, actually, going back to Burger Hill. There's a lot of innovation and a lot of activity that's gone on. And that, as I explained, is across a diverse set of energy activities. And one of the interesting things about Orkney is we're just at the ideal size where we're not too small that a lot of things sail us by and we can't manage to deal with them. And we're not too big that it becomes ridiculously expensive and complicated to do things. So we've got a kind of microcosm scale to what we're doing in terms of energy. And the fact that we have an archipelago of communities means that we're really well set, perhaps for the future, to experiment with different types of energy system and see how they might play out in each of those communities. But as well as those opportunities, we've also had a set of challenges. So we've had very high charges for our energy. We had a 2p surcharge for many years in the last couple of decades. The level of grid connectivity has been a problem, and the locational charging associated with that. We're very often off the strategy map when the UK government and even the Scottish government think about policy and strategy. And it's that classic thing where Orkney and Shetland are in the box in the Moray Firth, or sometimes we're not on the box, or not even on a box because we're not on the map. So we're often invisible, and that's in part because policy is very often led to deal with the average. It's not necessarily there to deal with the edges of the system, and that's one of the problems that we have. Another challenge that we've had is the instability in policy, particularly in Westminster, and at least in the last probably 10 years, it's been very difficult to get the DNO to engage with these strategic discussions with us as a community. So we need greater flexibility in regulations to overcome those issues. So there's 6 examples that we've picked over recent years. OREF had the opportunity to speak to Ofgem about our energy system, and these were the 6 areas that we focused on. So one, as I've explained, is that Orkney is a microcosm of the future of the UK. The energy prices for our customers, the system management and flexibility, just as we were going to launch the Reflex project that many of you have heard about, Ofgem changed the rules and made that a very difficult proposition. The grid access and charging is another issue that needs to be looked at, and improving the needs case system. At the moment, the DNO and TNOs have the responsibility for preparing a needs case for new system upgrades, but very often when we see these published, they fail to recognise the reality that we have as a community. And then that's linked to the strategic planning and connectivity. And just as we step forward to try and achieve net zero, it's really important that we have a view as to what our net zero solution is. What does Orkney look like as a net zero community when we've decarbonised? How big do the wires need to be? How much is electricity? How much is hydrogen? All of these things need to be thought about. So this is where we were in 2019. I'm sure many of you have seen this or derivatives of it. And that green box in the middle is the electricity bit. So that's the bit that we're all so proud of, that we've decarbonised. But if we're proud of that, then maybe there's another word to describe what we should feel about the rest of the hydrocarbons that we're still burning. So 85% of our energy system is still oil-based at the moment, and that's our big and biggest challenge. And that's quite a bit bigger than in some other communities, particularly because the amount of energy we use for transportation, and particularly marine transportation. So this idea of Orkney as a microcosm, if we look at the UK as it is today, you have this variability in supply and demand. And if we look to the future and expand renewables, we see that these peaks in supply vary compared to demand. So at times you're overproducing, at times you're underproducing. And this is one of the challenges that the UK system needs to face. But in Orkney at the present time, we're already facing that problem and finding solutions for it, which is where things like batteries, like hydrogen, like the smart integrating demand within our houses to supply, all of these measures are trying to smooth those curves out so we get a closer match between supply and demand. And in that way, Orkney is effectively a microcosm of what's to come. And not only that, but you can see here on this very nice stack, the transition that's gone from having not enough energy in Orkney. So this is the balance between importing and exporting. And in 2008, we were importing a lot of energy in red. And by 2018, we were exporting a lot of energy in green. So you can see there a very visual transition that's gone on over that period, and indeed has carried on since that time. Now, over the last 6 months, I guess there's been a series of meetings that OREF has been involved in, which have developed a strategy and an action plan for transitioning to net zero. And this is about to be published on the website, and it sets out in there a number of goals that Orkney could aspire to, and these link into the Sustainable Development Goals that the world is sharing. And alongside that, there's a more detailed action plan, which then looks at how each of these goals could and should be achieved. And some of the things that particularly maybe Laura's going to touch on is how these actions get integrated and taken forward to the next stage. And one of the things that we've had to recognise in this action planning process is that Orkney has a unique set of circumstances. And I think this is my favourite way of showing that, because this diagram shows shapes which reflect what they call privation profiles or wealth profiles, effectively. And if you look on this side on the left, you'll see that basically the top of each of those polygons is rich people, and the bottom of them are poor people, and the width shows how many people or less people. And each of those shapes represents a community. So you've got Aberdeen City there, which is first up. And what you can see is in Aberdeen City, there's quite a lot of quite rich people compared to along, which is, for example, Argyll there. And if you look at the dotted circles, they're the shapes that represent the Western Isles and Shetland, and the solid circle is representing Orkney. And I just think that's a very expressive way of looking at the diversity of Scottish local authorities and the challenges and opportunities that each one of those reflect in terms of the people and the circumstances that people live in those different places. So when we think about our energy future, it's not just thinking about that average future. We need to think about an energy future which is reflective of the circumstances in our particular place. And because we're going to talk about money, it's worthwhile acknowledging that maybe Orkney isn't the richest place in the world or in the country. You know, there are places that are better off. And we have very high levels of fuel poverty, with a combination of the amount of energy we use, the price we pay for that, and the incomes that we have coming into households. And so when we're looking toward the idea of transition, one of the things people say is, well, how are we going to pay for that? Who is going to pay for that transition? And the reality is that maybe we have less disposable income than other communities. We're probably not the poorest in the land, but we certainly don't have a lot of disposable income to put into that. And what we need to be thinking about then is not just the affordability of electricity, the fact that we don't have gas alternatives. There's also the wider cost of living pressures, because it's not just energy that's expensive, but our foodstuffs and other goods cost more to get in Orkney. We've got those transport costs on and off the island that other people don't have, and the costs associated with public transport. House building and refurbishment tends to be more expensive here than other places, and that leads to high rental costs, and our vehicle costs, boat costs, aircraft costs. All of these things have a surcharge associated with them, so we're not going to be the cheapest place to transition. And this is also shown in this graph, where what we've done here is plotted the amount of energy that's used in households in Orkney compared to the UK. So that blue curve is the UK household curve, the number of households in each of the energy use bands, and the yellow polygon is an Orkney curve that's superimposed on that. And what that shows is that the average Orkney household use of energy is about twice that of the UK average. Now that's interesting from an energy point of view, but it's also very interesting when the government has peddled the figure for the last few months about we're going to cap the average household energy bills at £2,500. We've all heard it on the news day in, day out. In Orkney speak, that means we're going to cap the average household energy price at £5,000, which is a very different proposition. And you can just imagine the uproar there'd have been in the country if all of those communities in England, Wales, and southern Scotland would have been faced with a £5,000 average energy bill. But that's what we were faced with. Now, people find different ways of combating that. Some decouple from the grid, some decouple rooms from heating. There's adaptations that people make in Orkney to allow themselves to adapt to that. Some of them just pay the money and enjoy the heat. But that's the reality that we live in. So that's really interesting when you start looking at government policy, which is planning for the average, and it ignores that peripheral pressure. And that average in Orkney, £5,000, isn't the most that people are paying. There will be households that are paying more than that, because that's just the average. So if we look at all of these pricing factors in our energy live, what you turn up with is quite a different dependence on energy financially, or the amount of energy, sorry, the amount of money that we spend in our households on energy items is significantly higher than other parts of the country. And this is true in terms of the percentage metrics that you see on calculators, but also in terms of the monetary figures. And here you can see the breakdown of a typical house. Welcome to kind of contrast that with maybe your own situation. It may be a bit less, it may be a bit more. You may spend money on some areas that other people spend in other areas. But we think that on balance, in Orkney, we spent, and this was actually before the energy crisis, somewhere between £9,000 and £14,000 per year on energy-related costs. Now, this isn't just electrons and fuel, but it's the other things that we spend money on where net zero is going to play a part. So if you go on the ferry or you go on an aircraft south, that's something that is going to have to transform to net zero. So we've included that cost within there. So that's a significant part of household income that's represented by our energy live. And what we were interested in is what happens if we aggregate that together. And this isn't now just for Orkney, but we've done it for the 3 island groups. And so looking at Orkney, look at a population of 22,000, about 10,000 households. And if you think of that, basically 10,000 to 15,000 pound sum, and multiply that by 10,000 households, you come to 150 million pounds a year that we spend as a community on energy related items. And there's a similar amount in the Western Isles and Shetland in relation to their population. And if you aggregate all that together, it probably comes round to oil. Thank you. Looking for the right bolded figure. 490 million pounds a year in the islands that we're spending at the moment on energy. So the choice that we've got is either do we keep spending 490 million a year burning oil, buying cars that burn oil, buying oil-fired heating systems, not insulating our homes, running ferries that burn oil, buying tugs that burn oil, flying aircraft that burn oil, or do we start spending basically almost £500 million a year on making a transition? And that means making conscious decisions to spend our money in different ways. The important thing is that we're spending a huge amount of money already as we live. So this isn't about doing something necessarily different. We're not spending new money, we're just spending the existing money we've got in different ways. Now, the difficulty with that is that renewables kind of front-end stack the cost. Renewable technologies and clean technologies tend to be more expensive to buy, but cheaper to operate. Whereas oil burning equipment is cheaper to buy, but more expensive to operate because you're having to buy the fuel. So what we need to do is effectively invest money rather than just spend money, and therefore have a higher capital cost at the start and then enjoy the dividends later on. Now, not all of us, and many of us, or any of us perhaps, have the money to do that. So the crux of the transition is that it's not spending more money overall, it's getting it front-end loaded to the next 5-7 years so that we can buy the right kind of equipment to see us through the next 20. And then that way we need some kind of banking system or mortgage system. And if you look at the 20-year spend across the 3 island groups, it comes to £10 billion. So that's probably the total investment fund that we're looking to do. And these figures, if you go and look at Scotland or UK or even other countries and the estimates they've got, these figures are kind of equivalent to what their transition funding levels are looking at. So we're not exceptional, but it's interesting to reflect on that because this is what we're already involved in. So these are the kind of things that we might get involved in within our houses, within our businesses, and within our community. So there's the upgrade to our houses themselves. There's all of the things that we do around our houses, the work that we do in our transport and our purchases. In a business sense, there's a whole load of things that businesses do relating to energy that are going to need to change. And then in a wider community, we've got a whole set of other things that we need to do. And this was a figure some of you have probably seen before, which basically shows how that 9 or 10 billion pounds is made up of the kind of transition activities that might be associated with basically creating the tools to generate renewable energy in the islands, but also the system for us to use that energy in our lives, in our businesses, and in our journeys on and off the island. So that is a very large amount of money that needs to be spent. It's an amount of money we're going to spend anyhow if we just carry on in business as usual. And the price shock, if you look at the last year and the change in energy prices across the 3 island groups, we've probably spent £70 million just by sitting here waiting for that price cap to drop on us. That's cost our communities £70 million just because we had no power over it. It happened, and that was the influence it had on us. So if we start to take that power back literally and financially, we get the chance to do something more. Now, I mentioned ScotWind and INTOG, and this gives some even more eye-watering figures. Already, there's probably £50 billion worth of investment that's been announced through ScotWind 1 and the INTOG round that was announced recently. And that's money that's going to go into offshore wind turbines that are going to be located in and around those small green areas that you can see on the map with the numbers. The larger green areas indicate where it's in all likelihood likely that wind turbines might go in the future, which would be of a capacity to take us towards net zero as the UK. So for the UK to achieve that, it needs about 150 gigawatts of new power. INTOG and ScotWind have so far delivered about 35 gigawatts. So it's about 5 times or 4 or 5 times what we've done to date. And that means around 10,000 wind turbines would probably be involved, and an investment of around 200 billion pounds around the island groups and Aberdeenshire. So really huge amounts of money. But when you reflect on the energy system and how much money went into the oil and gas, maybe in the 70s, 80s and 90s, it's not, if you like, it's not without reference to what we've done before. So how are we going to get help delivering on this and going through this transition? And this was at the heart of one of the challenges that Reflex was trying to address, because as a team, we realized that these costs, the technology, isn't accessible to everybody. And what we wanted to try and do was to create a system where we had this energy bank that could effectively capitalize technology and allow it to come into people's homes and into people's businesses. And so one way that you could look at that happening is if you think of virtually most houses, they have a mortgage. So that is effectively a loan on an asset. What we're looking to do is to improve the quality of that asset, to introduce insulation and heating that's appropriate for it, and data management issues and things like that. And this is, there was a scheme the government had called the Green Deal a couple of years ago. There wasn't great uptake on it then, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't necessarily something like the right idea. So if our mortgage providers could give us actually loans to allow us to go through that energy transition and make our homes net zero, that might be a really good way of financing it. It then puts it within the framework that we're already borrowing money from. And the idea is that that mortgage, the energy mortgage, would stay with the house. So even if you sold the house, that mortgage would stay with it and would be taken on by the next owner. Now, there are quite a few people thinking about this kind of scheme and looking to see whether it could be introduced. There are places in the housing cycle, like, for example, when you sell a property, that's a really good time to go through that process because everything's disrupted. You empty the house, somebody else comes in. So if you said, well, every house sale is going to have a month of energy upgrade incorporated within it. That might be something that we need to think about as a community, as a society, to help go through the transition. The other place where we're already seeing quite a lot of movement is in transport. So the public transport has improved hugely in Orkney over recent years, and the more electrical and hydrogen solutions we use there, the better. E-bikes and e-mobility scooters are seen, again, much more commonly around the islands. You see all the cruise liner people coming off in the blue bikes as well now as well. The EV club, has become highly successful. There's over 150 members, and we've got the leasing and the buying of second-hand cars and electric vehicles, which is really going at a pace now. And we've got, I think, close to 750 vehicles in Orkney that are now electric vehicles, and that percentage is going up each week. And alongside the vehicles, we've also got the chargers. There's some new money that's just been awarded for public destination chargers, and there's the household charging grants as well, which are available to people. So there's quite a lot of finance available around vehicles, and in a way, that's why we're making more progress there than we probably are with the housing. And going back to this idea of lessons learned, the Reflect project as a UKRI-funded project just finished in March. And as part of that, the project team were tasked with capturing the lessons learned and sharing that with other people in the country. And it's literally a 120-page document of lessons learned from that 4 years of experience. Now, some of those lessons were really good experiences about things that worked. Others were things that maybe didn't work. Some of them were relating to Orkney, others were relating to general systems in the UK. But alongside that, we've got the upside of the opportunities that we've seen, the members that have signed up for that, the households that have taken on the services and the technology that's available. And hopefully, Reflect can then act as a springboard to work with other organisations in the community to deliver that citizen-based service that is going to be so desperately needed over the next 5 to 7 years in that transition. So alongside that then is this idea of the bank and the investment. So as I said, they're quite eye-watering sums are involved. But again, it's always quite useful, I think, to look at what we're doing already. And if we've had some insights through some of the reports that are produced by some of the public sector bodies, and by doing some calculations on what might be happening in the private sector, we think that at the moment, Orkney has around £2 billion invested in stocks, shares, other forms of investment off the island. So that's a considerable amount of money. And each year, there's a sum of maybe 30 to 50 million pounds that's added to that amount. And at the moment, most of that's invested off Orkney. It's invested in companies that an independent financial advisor will advise, and there's well-known companies, some of them in the oil sector that people get pushed towards, but also in the IT sector, the Googles, the Intels, the Microsoft, that really attract a lot of money out the pension funds. So one option that we've got is to repatriate some of that. And that's an individual decision. It might be a collective decision in some of the public sector organisations to see whether we can bring some of that investment home. If we were all able to put 10% of what we've invested in our pensions into a local Orkney bank, Orkney fund, that would achieve an awful lot of this transition, because what we're talking about is not spending money, we're talking about investing money in our energy future. Now, we've seen how that can work through the feed-in tariffs, which really funded and enticed people to put in the microturbines. And the 700 microturbines are a classic example of where Orcadians have invested in their energy future. They've put money in upfront and got a reward over the long term. So we're looking at really institutionalizing that across a lot of what we're doing. So as well as just the pure money, we also need to think about the organizational structure of that. And this is a slide that we've used probably for the last 5, almost 10 years now. Well, it can't be 10 years, because it's got elements of it that are quite modern, but say let's last 3 or 4 years anyhow, which tries to describe the structures that we've got in our community, which allow us to collaborate and do things which maybe other communities haven't got that structure to do. And so thinking about where an energy bank might sit, who would be in charge of it, how would the funds be distributed? It would have to live up to the standards of a just transition fund, so it wouldn't have to be the same as an existing bank where they kind of have so many rules about who can't get money. This needs to be something that allows funding and finance for everybody in the community, and it's designed specifically and set up to do that. And I don't know if anybody has seen a film called A Bank Called Dave. Has anybody seen that film? Yeah. So this is about an entrepreneur in Burnley, and he ran it was a vehicle leasing business, and he was very successful. And he started loaning little bits of money to people in his neighbourhood, and he ended up loaning to 200 people about £5 million. And you can probably guess how many defaults he had across those 200 loans. It was zero. Nobody defaulted on it. Everybody paid him back. And he went on then to try and create a structured bank. He got the whole system thrown at him, but he's still in operation. And I'm hoping that we can get him up to talk OREF later on this year about how that was set up. But it shows what's possible at a community level by getting together and trying to break the mold of the finance model that's there already and do something that's a bit more new and innovative. So to finish, if we're going to achieve an accelerated carbon transition, that community endeavour, I would say, is bigger than Hudson Bay, the whaling, the fishing, the farming, the wartime, the oil, and COVID. And you think about how much effort in that last trial of COVID that we put into things. We had hundreds of people changing their jobs and going and doing new roles. Maybe we need to think about mobilizing our community in that way to overcome the climate challenges that we have. And across that community effort, we need engagement, empowerment, and all of those good things. And that's going to come through working together. Orkney always does best when we work together and collaborate, pooling our resources, mixing up teams flexibly to help get things done. So that's hopefully a little bit of insight into some of the scary numbers that are ahead of us, but also maybe some of the pathways that might make that journey a little bit easier. And the key thing to remember is we're spending the money already day by day on our old energy system. What we need to do is just change where that money goes, and we need some help on the capital side of that to allow that to happen. So I'll finish there. And yeah, happy to do, yeah.
So, if your head's really like mine, just a couple of minutes where we take some questions. And thank you very much, Gareth. That was just amazing. Before we move on to Laura, guys, I think we'll all be going. If anyone wants to get a coffee, just refresh themselves as well, please feel free to do so. But we'll take any questions now, either online or please get a coffee. Oh, that's good. Anyone? Yes.
You sort of mentioned that the mean electricity consumption is 4,800 kilowatt hours per year. That's significantly lower than I previously thought it was. So I was just wondering where that data set or the information had come from.
It was out of the database that we had of consumption from in the reflex files.
So base. I'm just wondering if it got compared by MPAM instead of households, because that would significantly alter that number.
Yeah.
I think it had been closer to 8,000 kilowatt hours. I mean, great if the consumption's gone down that much, but I'm angry.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. It's a really good point, Evelyn. And obviously, if it makes it even worse, it kind of makes the point even greater. So I've always tried to not make it the biggest it can be, but that's really helpful and a good reminder. Yeah.
Hey, Gareth, I stuck in the chat there. I'm guessing that's probably electricity only. I agree with Evelyn. I think we'd expect a lot higher for the energy. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not Big Brother, that's Mark Holes on Zoom.
You talked a little bit as if this was an option. We had an option to carry on the way we were, and we have an option of decarbonising, which will be expensive. But I would have thought that the way that finance would do this is it would become financially beneficial to decarbonise, so that government policy would have to make it more expensive not to decarbonise, so that, for example, the cost of fuel oil will increase rapidly in the next few years, so people won't choose to decarbonise, they'll be forced to decarbonise.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I think the point I would say is that I do feel that early transition will be cheaper, but it'll involve spending capital up front. So there'll be a boost of capital, and then you get the benefit over the longer term. And so the challenge at the moment is for ordinary households in the world we live in, with mortgage rates, etc., going up, is a lot of household budgets are being squeezed. So it's really a kind of call to arms to say, if we believe that we need to follow that pathway, do we all believe that there's a capital need? And if we all do believe that, then we need to start consistently saying that to the people that can help us organise that, which might be our local authority, it might be government agencies, government themselves, as well as financial institutions. And so that's kind of part of the role of OREF, is to, if you like, explore these ideas and see what the mood of the community is like. And if we feel that this is something we need to go after, we kind of go after it. So I think that's aligned with what you're saying. I think one of the other challenges is that we see probably short-term decision making. People that are responsible for capital funds in particular, it can be much easier to make the, if you're faced with a decision, I'll choose Tug as an example. If you're faced with a decision about investing in Tug, the easiest thing is to invest in the Tug that you had last time round, which burned diesel. It's much harder to have the courage to go for something that works on electric or hydrogen or hybrid. Now, I think there was a kind of nod towards being able to change to a new system, but we still ended up buying diesel burning Tug. So that kind of falls off the pathway that we're talking about, because it's not, and that's a decision that's then baked into that Tug for the next 10, 15 years. So those big items of capital where we spend stuff and we choose to make it carbon dependent, those are really bad decisions, I think, in the world we're living in. But it's trying to find a structure that helps and encourages people to make the brave decisions.
I'm wondering if it's a case of it's changing the narrative to show that at the moment what we're doing is socializing the cost of how we deal with energy at the moment, and we're socializing the cost both in terms of the way that the oil and gas industry and private utility companies are being supported by public money, and then privatizing the profits from that.
Yep.
But also we're socializing the cost in terms of the cost to us as human beings, who all are now having to face the effect of climate change. So how can we make that narrative explicit so that when we're then talking about investing in clean decarbonized technologies, we're actually showing that we're still, we all benefit as well as paying for it?
Absolutely, Becky. And in a way, it's hard. There's a technical discussion here, and there's an economic and a social discussion, but in the end, there's a political discussion to have as well. What you've described and what we live through are people's political decisions. And I think, I feel like my premise is that we've been on the wrong end of a lot of political decisions in the last few decades. And there is going to be hopefully a change, but we need to kind of articulate how that change needs to look after island communities. One of the things that I think Orkney's been very good at in the last, say, 10 years is at times of political change, we've sat down and said, what do we want? How do we want that to work? And the Our Islands, Our Future initiative was an example of that. After the independence referendum, there was a Smith Commission. We made representation to that. And so with the political things that are going to be happening here in the next, or in the country over the next few years, it's a really good time to be very clear about what we think our pathway is and how that can work. So that, I think, is a way of doing it.
Zoom next. Zoom.
Oh, is that me? Hi. Gareth, I don't know if you want to say anything, or do you experience a tension between, we were talking about building renovation, how do we can't just completely continue to sit on the fence. Either we're in a climate emergency or we're not. And so I'm just thinking of, conservation areas, planning restrictions, sticking single glazed windows back in wooden frames. And I don't know what we do. I see a tension. I don't know if you see a tension with that. It's sort of allied to what you were saying.
Oh, absolutely. In life, you're always managing risks and opportunities, and at different stages in life, you have, that balance changes. And maybe 20 years ago, it was kind of acceptable to have single glazed windows put back in houses. I think for the last 15 years, that probably hasn't been acceptable, and we need to change it. So, there's very smart ways of renovating houses where you keep in essence, the character of them without having to live in a cold, drafty house as well. So that, those are the things that we absolutely need to get after. Yeah.
I've got a promise from Laura to chat as well. So that's excellent. And Robert, did you have a?
No, I'll give it to them.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for great questions as well. That's been absolutely excellent. And Laura, the stage is now set for you. We're very lucky to have Laura with us tonight from Orkney Council. Very kind to her.
Oh, I'm not from Orkney Council.
And by the way, the feedback is the microphones are working an absolute treat for people on Zoom. Because that's who they're for, it's not bothering.
Okay, am I working okay? Can you hear me okay up here in the sky? Am I getting a thumbs up from anybody? Excellent, excellent. Cool. Hi. Thank you very much. I got to be pointy as well. Thank you. Oh, sorry. It's on. Hi, I'm Laura Hutton. I'm the project director for the Island Centre for Net Zero, and I'm based at EMEC rather than the council, but the council is one of our project partners. Yes, yes. Thank you very much. So, just a little background for anyone who I've not spoken to before. I moved up to Orkney in January, started the job in December, and before that I was working at Ofgem, where I first came across ORF in a lovely consultation response. So thank you for sending that in. That was very, very well written, very well received. I can't remember what the consultation was, but I do remember reading it. And I was very familiar with the challenges in Orkney well before this, the crazy constraints and the work of Reflex. So you're famous, basically. Just so you're aware. Today, I wanted to cover a few different things because I know some of you will have seen some variation of these slides before, and others might not have seen this at all. So this is a bit of an introduction, a bit of an update, and also a bit of an idea on how you can engage with the project at this stage and how we look to with people going forward, because this is about community engagement, isn't it? Oh, that's the right way. Lovely. So hopefully you can see that they're a little bit obscured by the people on the sides. But highlighted in the yellow is our project. This is the full Islands Growth Deal project cohort. That was finalised finally in February, January. But it's been a really, really long process. I'm sure you may have been familiar with the long, painful process that a lot of people in ORF contributed to getting over the line. So we're only in month 4 of the project, but this has been in the works for years. And the Island Centre for Net Zero is one of the 3, you see the dark blue bands, is one of the 3 Pan-Island projects. So this is the one led in Orkney. There's Creative Islands and Wellbeing is led in the Western Alps, and Talented, which is sort of the jobs education project, is led out of Shetland. So we're all working together across these projects. We've got the net zero one, we've got the climate one based here, and we have £16.5 million from the Islands deal. The whole pot is £100 million. And one of our deliverables, which I'll get onto in a bit, is supporting those other projects in their decarbonisation ambitions. So there's other sort of projects going on. So these are our project partners. I'm sure you're familiar with many of them. Probably worth noting that this is the Reflex Consortium plus the other islands councils. So it's a lot of the same thinking, people who have come together before and worked really well together, carrying forward good ideas. And that's a wee bit more detail, so it's not just me shouting into the void, there are other people here. People on the call, we've got Gareth is on the steering committee, we've got Susan, Professor Susan Crumdyke on the call, just popped in. Mark, you'll have heard. I think that's everybody here tonight. Oh, sorry, Thibaut is obviously working with us too. Becky, everyone should raise your hand if you're working in ICNZ. there's a lot of faces. So we're in the process of recruiting other parties within the project, but just so you're aware, if I'm too scary to speak to, there's a whole bunch of other people you can talk to about what we're doing, because I am only going to be skimming the surface in this short presentation. So there's a lot of words there, and again, this is hopefully going to be shared afterwards, so you can read it in a bit more fully. But in a nutshell, what we're doing with the project is pulling together a pan-island distributed innovation centre. So our core purpose is to decarbonise the islands and support the decarbonisation of the islands. Obviously, with 16.5 million, we've got 10 years to do this. And as Gareth said, there's about a 9 billion investment needed to decarbonise the island. So we're not going to do it on our own, but we're going to stimulate action in that direction and support other projects and activities needed to get us there. We are in the project developing a toolkit that allows us to continuously engage and keep the foot on the pedal, which is something that a lot of innovation projects, in my experience with innovation projects, and I'm sure you may have experience, that's okay, you may have experience with this yourselves. Innovation projects quite often run out of time. Like they get some great findings pulled together. They run out of time, they run out of budget. The people disperse because they have 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. They don't have the time to bed into or knuckle down into what they're doing. So 10 years is a huge value within this project. And another really key bit, which I'd point to for tonight for the community engagement focus, is that a really core component within the project is quality stakeholder engagement, which we're hoping to achieve through the Islands Community Action Network, led by Community Energy Scotland, working across the project, which will be across the island groups. That's not the only way we want to be engaging with people, and I want to get onto that in a moment as well. And project targets here is just around what we've committed to in writing within the project. So that's evidenced acceleration of decarbonisation. Again, we're not going to be able to do it all with the 16.5 million over that period of time. Green job creation, so developing new industries where they are needed. Stimulating economic growth across existing renewable supply chains, so growth of supply chains. Supporting the other island steel project with their decarbonisation ambitions. Is worth saying that not all the islands growth deals, not all the growth deals, so we're the 12th out of 14 growth deals in Scotland. Not all of them are this decarbonisation focused, so that's a real success for the islands growth deal itself. And developing international best practice. So that again is sort of boosting what we can do, putting Orkney, putting the islands on the map. So this is a little bit of a structure of what we're doing. I've mentioned that toolkit in the middle. Project management, a little hat at the top, and carbon downshifts projects down the bottom. So we have capital funding to do things. It's maybe another sort of drawing I need to do, which I haven't done here, is that how our funding is split is that largely the capital spend for Shetland and Outer Hebrides is withheld for doing big capital demonstration projects at this stage. Currently undetermined exactly what those will look like. And that's probably the key message I want you to take away from tonight, is that we've got a structure and we've got a means to engage with people in many different ways, but we have not determined exactly what those projects are going to look like. And that's kind of the point. We need the people to tell us what needs to be done and what's going to work on the ground. So a lot of that capital budget for Shetland and the Outer Hebrides is sitting in capital pots to be signed off at a later date. And a good chunk of the Orkney money is in developing this toolkit. And some of that is in the TRL space, or technology readiness level 4 to 6, where we can do demonstrations. I'm sorry, there's a cat about to walk in the room, if that's concerning to anybody. Very interested in decarbonisation. So I don't want to take a black cat walking past in the back. We'll scrap that from the minutes. So yes, we've got a good bit of the budget is in this replicable piece, because, as I'm saying, projects can come and they can go, and if you put your eggs in one basket, you might not get very far in the decarbonisation journey. So we've got lots of different opportunities within this. I'm not even pointing my pointer. Here we go. Lots of different opportunities within this toolbox. I know. Just for people in the room, but I think 2/3 of the people online know this box very well. So what we have is a data exchange, so a means of pulling together data and baselining where we're at, which is already a debate we've had tonight with Evelyn raising what's our baseline. Is it consistent? Are our assumptions similar across the different island groups? And what story does that tell us? The transition labs. So Susan is going to be joining you, I think, at a later date for an ORF event to present to you what the transition labs do, essentially. And I'm going to butcher this, and she's going to murder me. It's going through a methodology of identifying an ecosystem where we are hugely dependent on fossil fuels, and going, what did we do before we had access to these fossil fuels? Surely there's something we can learn from that, and working around the problem rather than returning back to the vicious cycle of going, but it works so well, which it does, and we know it does because we use it so much. The community action networks, which I've raised before, which is a sort of established feedback loop, two-way communication across the islands, not just in Cockwall, not just in Lerwick, not just in Stornoway, across the islands with existing community organisations, existing groups, so that we can get feedback on exactly what the problems are experienced by people in their day-to-day lives. Because not everyone is thinking about hydrogen every day. Not everyone's thinking about offshore wind. They're thinking about their lived experience, and what, in many cases, what little difference they feel they can make to recycling, these kinds of things. So the Islands Accelerator is a really critical piece as well. These are all very critical, as you might have captured. The Islands Accelerator's purpose is to leverage additional funding. So identify other sources of funding where we have a specific use case or a specific project that we need to investigate further. If there's research needing done, if there's a demonstration needing done, we can identify match funding and do more with the money we've already secured, and make that last. Essentially, as I say, keeping our foot on the pedal. And test and demonstration zones, that's where I was mentioning the sort of technology readiness level 4 to 6, where we've got pieces. And I will not forget to your point about building regulations and listed buildings. So this is where we can take known problems with maybe a couple of barriers in the way, and we can carry them forward. Sorry, I'm realising I should probably move around a bit so I can see a bit. So we can take known problems and we can get over specific barriers or specific humps we know are in the way. Some examples of this are we're looking to do regulatory sandbox is still an iffy term I'm not sure about using, but not in a bad way, but I don't know that they are limited to regulation. Essentially, buildings are a massive challenge, as you'll know. We're standing in Stromness right now. or sitting in Stromness, which is a listed area, as I understand it. So there's huge challenges in things like getting energy efficient windows put in. So sort of clashing with the great historical significance of violence and our need to decarbonise, and working out where does the buck stop? Where does the computer say no? Because quite often the different components of that, so Historic Environment Scotland that own the regulations, might say that's not a problem. The planning department says, well, that's not what Historic Environment Scotland told us when we last spoke to them. And we need to get these people in a room and work out what we need to do to stop this from continuously happening to everybody who tries to make these changes. So we've made some progress in starting conversations about setting up these types of forums. It won't be the first. I know a lot of people will be like, we've been at this for years. That's the point. We're around for 10 years. We can keep our foot on the pedal and we can learn from what you've done before, which I'm really hoping you come and tell me all the things you've done before. Okay, I will move on to switching time. So themes. I'm going to have a wee pause here and I'll go through some of these, but these are the themes we've identified in the course for business case. I would say that Gareth's focus was quite strongly on energy. I'd say there's other opportunities. There's other places we can look to decarbonise. And I'd say if there's anything we can do whatsoever, if there's opportunities we can grab, we need to be going for them. So yes, we've got transport. I think this is a very similar slide to you, Gareth. So we've got transport covered, many different sources of emissions in transport, heat and buildings, and obviously the costs associated with that. So individuals, sustainability, so carbon sequestration, not so much peat in Orkney other than Hoy, but this is something very big in Shetland and the Western Isles too. Biodiversity, much of which is across the islands. Power, which is where we start getting into challenges like the constraints. And the tricky conversation, which I know, Gareth, you talked about flexibility briefly. Flexibility is where I last worked at Ofgem in that space. And the really tricky conversation between, we don't have a huge amount of demand in Orkney. From a grid perspective, they're saying, you know what, you need to up your demand because you've got too much generation. That will sort out your grid problems. Nobody can afford to up their demand. So the individual support.
That's not true though, because if you increase your demand, you'll run out of capacity. I don't know where you put that information from, but that's not true.
So if you increase your demand,
yeah,
you prevent the imbalance that Gareth is showing on his grid.
But not if you take our output from wind power. The day when we have no wind and you've increased your demand, you run out of capacity and you can't supply the load.
I don't know that capacity is sorry, I'll maybe come back to this at the end because so questions were more around other categories we could be looking at. But we could talk about this another time. Or here, but maybe later.
But yeah, it's just that statement was not actually correct. That's all. But you know. Anyway, carry on.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so whole systems. Again, this is looking at where we're talking about taking things off of the grid because the grid is causing problems here. So that's where hydrogen came into the picture here. So yes, and electricity pricing, which again, we're getting into national issues. And this is where percolating around all these different issues, we need to think about what we can do practically at a local level, what we can do now and what we need to be building a case for at a national level. And that's where the sort of pan-island power comes from, pan-island power. I've not done that before. I don't think you get what I mean. The sort of capability of us together building an evidence case for what needs to be done. So yeah, I don't know if anyone's spotting any gaps here of categories we should also be looking at. Debo?
Just more like economic sectors. So you got production processes, so primarily foods, anything manufacturing. Then you got any all the services. I'm missing in here.
Sorry, I'm not understanding. Sorry.
As in, sorry, like providing services like healthcare, any like tourism, anything like that needs, and obviously it's relying on other things, but you need, like a lot of people have to fly to Aberdeen to get essential healthcare.
That's a good point. So like another category, almost like essential services rather than like
Like lifeline services. I guess.
lifeline services, yeah.
And waste, I guess.
Waste, thank you, yes.
Cows.
Cows,
Cows on.
yes.
Primary production.
Sorry, primary production. I know primary production's a bit of a weird term for it. But you're totally right, cows. And terra commission.
I've forgotten it. Fisheries and forestry.
Fisheries, forestry, all in there, yeah. Need to expand that out. Cool. Okay, I'll jump ahead to where we are now. So just for a bit of context, we're in month 4. We're just entered month 4 of 120 months of this project. Don't look so daunting. So we're very much in setup stage, which is why you won't have heard too much from us, because we're basically building our ranks. We're recruiting, we're developing the toolkit that we've talked about, and we're identifying the links to other projects and what else is going on right now, because we don't want to duplicate unnecessarily. We don't want to go over old ground where something's been learned before that maybe we're not aware of. But I'm hopeful that with such a good cohort working in the project, we'll have good access to these points. And hopefully we can also come back to you at ORF and have this conversation when we're at a more advanced stage and check in with you. Yes, identifying the existing data sources so we know where our baseline is, what we've got, and where our gaps are. We need to do some further investigations. Ways to engage at this stage. There's a lot of coming soons though, but you're more than welcome, and I'm really keen for you to reach out directly to us. We have a contact form on our website, which is just on the next page. You can email me, give us a phone. We're just up the hill here most of the time. We're going to be having launch events. Again, we're just getting our communications team into post, which is very exciting. And we're going to be having launch events across the different islands for anyone who listens in from the other islands. We're also going to be developing the islands community action networks that we're talking about. So there might be something more local to you that you might want to engage through. And lastly, this is something that will be on your radar when it comes to fruition. We'll share it through ORF as well. Net Zero Nation, there's a small amount of funding secured through the ICNZ to support carbon accreditation for small to medium enterprises. So there's 10 businesses in Orkney, 10 in Shetland, and 10 in the Western Isles for anyone who wants to keep their ears up for that, because I know there's huge benefits to getting that done. For us, it's a great way to reach out and engage with different sectors as well and start those conversations. So yeah, I don't know, Gareth, if you got any more. You've covered your questions. I'm more than happy to take questions, or we can continue the.
All right, thank you very much. I don't know about you, but clearly I didn't know much about ICNZ either, so I thought it was run out of the council. So that's been great education for me, if nothing else, and I hope you also found it equally beneficial. So as Laura said, she's going to take some questions, which is great, and I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more from you over the period, but what a great start of an introduction to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, your microphone's just.
Given some of the issues that you highlighted and that we know about for the electricity system, and I mean, like at the moment, we can't even get folk up to replace broken meters, and I think although in Great Britain 56% of households now have smart meters, the penetration in the Orkney is like 9%, and you know there's just so many ways in which we're now benefiting, and in fact we're being punished for being part of the UK system. Do we need to urgently look at, greater ownership locally to allow us to do a lot of what we want to do? I've written a letter to the local media this week suggesting it anyway, but I'd be interested in other folks' plans. Sorry.
I can answer, and then Gareth, if you want to go. So for my part, I don't think we have enough information because there's a changing picture going on. The grid is, and this is personal view, obviously not from my previous employer. The personal view is that the grid is antiquated and broken for lots of people. It's not just an island issue how broken the grid is. It's not servicing, or it's not prepared for the level of distributed generation that we have on the system. They're looking at so many different ways of fixing this. I believe there's a white paper on, and I've had this conversation earlier today as well, about your storage, which would allow you, when the network's constrained up here, to operate your own off your own energy. That's considered to be, storage is considered to be generation by the grid. So you're prevented from operating more smartly in a way that would actually make life easier for the grid because of a specific regulation. Other issues are things like flexibility, and this point I make about you alleviate constraint issues if you can match up your demand and generation. So when the wind blows, you're consuming energy. You'll be possibly familiar with this process. We can't do that up here at this moment, and there's a very limited still. It's a very, very nascent offering at the distribution level across the UK. It's only really happening where aggregators are operating rather than individual communities. And then you've got the problem of, even if we electrify everything really successfully, then we're still at the mercy of national grid pricing, which could go, even if they decouple it from gas prices, we don't know what the replacement for that would be. So to some degree, I agree. There is a look at more locational pricing, how well that works for your big long-term investments like offshore wind, and even your onshore, like payments you get on your for small generators might be hugely reduced. So the economic picture is just like up, pros and cons all over the place, and also huge like long-term investments are depending on the system just pre-existing as it is right now. So much more investigation. I don't know if that's helpful. It's probably just convoluted.
In connection with the meters, that was broken directly, deliberately, by Ofgem. They banned the DNO from putting in meters. Prior to that, meters got put in by the DNO and it worked perfectly. But Ofgem chose to ban that, and I've already written to our MSP about this and asked him to take it up, but he hasn't got anywhere with Ofgem.
Right.
Yeah. Feels like we're on the front page of the Arcadian again, Rob. Saying which direction do we go in? Yeah, I think we've known for a while that energy is probably one of the things that makes you think about whether you're part of a system or not, and whether it's better to be not part of the system. One of the things that we see, and we're lucky enough to kind of work in other parts of the world, is that other people are beginning to question their integrated power systems, at a national level as well. Often for similar reasons that, of inefficiency and the lack of centralized systems to recognize the needs of the periphery and the people that aren't average. And so I don't think we're alone in that. And as Laura said, it's a big investment challenge. Kind of as I was trying to say before, is that at the moment it feels like we're just sleepwalking through spending disposable income on our existing system, and that's amounting to a huge amount of money. And it does take us to be more inventive as a community if we're going to gather together and invest it. But it wouldn't be the first time that it happened in Orkney, and I think that's something that, if we are serious about even contemplating alternative forms of governance, then managing alternative forms of finance are going to be an essential part of that as well. And so I hope that, you know, OREF has been, if you like, a collective who all of you, or many of you, have come and spoken about this for years. And I really hope that in the next few months, as maybe some of the political wheels start churning and looking at these issues, that energy is considered in that, and OREF is involved in that. And maybe as a board, actually, we could, if people were minded to, we could take that and maybe drop a letter to the council just saying that, you know, OREF feels that energy is an important part of governance, and if we're looking at governance solutions, we should be looking at energy solutions as well.
Maybe.
Anybody that thinks that's a bad idea?
Gareth.
No, I think it's a great idea. And I thought the original sort of grenade that was thrown in was suggesting an Orkney grid rather than a national grid, and just cut the wire and then run it ourselves. We can do some of this already. You said that you can't control demand and supply yourself, but if you've got an electric car, you can charge it when the sun's out, and you can choose to do that, and it doesn't cost you anything because the electricity doesn't go into the grid. So you can subvert the grid yourself. There's nothing to stop you doing that with your neighbour. I believe the council is looking at doing that with their big wind turbines when they get them, if they ever get them at Quaterniss. Where will the electricity go? Could it go directly to the council offices? Sort of like a privatized parallel grid.
No, I'm going to let Evelyn respond. I think she's.
Sorry, just on that private wire network aspect. Yeah, I think that's very unlikely that a private wire network would work for the council in that situation because their properties are so far spread out, and so the actual cost of putting in the basically duplicate infrastructure in all of the roads and stuff isn't going to be worthwhile. And at the end of the day, that's just what I want to say on that. I have other things, but I'll let Lynn respond.
Yeah, and I know exactly what you mean about you can on a small scale. You could do a certain degree of self-balancing, but if you have a grid connection, you're still kind of at the mercy of the rules, like the national rules attached to that. And there's another point that maybe gets missed off this conversation a fair bit, which is around resilience. And I think that at a national level, the resilience conversation is a very different kettle of fish, because I think there's put it this way, since moving up here, there's a much greater acceptance. There's a much greater resilience in the Highlands, and a sort of lowercase resilience, with people being used to services being cut off. That doesn't make it okay. There's let's say, a history of people putting up with more of this than they should have had to, living at the extremities, and that, I think, possibly plays into the resilience conversation, where on the national grid they say there's a certain level of resilience that has to be maintained and backup for any sort of blackout situations, which maybe would be a different story if you had a separate grid.
And we're going to go online next to Mark Hull.
Caught quite a few of my points from when I had my hand up. But yeah, no, I'll be looking forward to reading your letter, Rob, in the paper. It is genuinely, it'll be interesting to hear what you're saying for that point of view. I mean, for Laura's point of view, we have had examples. I mean, I would say Heat Smart Orkney, an example where we've done an aggregator on community level, and we tried to feed that into Reflex, but we're hitting too many barriers at a larger scale for that. But I very much fall in the same camp as Laura, as far as I would be I'll be very, very reluctant to cut the wire for that point of view. I mean, so much, the grid is just the best battery we can have, the best storage, and anyone that's actually tried to be off grid is a much harder challenge than grid connection. And I think we have some opportunities. As far as reform goes, Laura, maybe with a local energy bill coming through, is going to push further the opportunity to balance locally and do some things locally. But yeah, and I forgot my last point now because I've been sitting here for too long. I was trying to remember what it was now, but it was along the lines of I think we have opportunities, but we go in there with caution. I know that was it on resilience, Laura. I think historically we've had a situation where people have been able to cope with being off grid, but we've moved along so much now that I don't think Orkney's that much more resilient than nationally as far as power cuts and things go. I sit in a new house now, and I found out with the first power grid that my gas oven goes off when the power cuts now because it's got a safety feature built into it. I couldn't make and justify the investment of putting in that multi-burner in my sitting room. So I'm quite vulnerable when the power goes off. And through our creeping modernization, I think we're much less resilient than we used to be. So I'll be really, really nervous about relying on any level of resilience, especially thinking from the sectors of those who have least agency at the moment and those the most vulnerable across the community. So and that comes into some of what we pay for in the grid. That was really my second point. Yeah.
Mark. On the subject of resilience, I think a good example of how, to take your words, antiquated the grid is last summer, the huge disruptions there were on mainland UK because of the heat. That's gonna get worse because we've had like last week every day. That's way too close, Mike. Every day was the hottest day of the year of or the hottest day on Earth, and in Orkney we're gonna get stronger winds, so our grid is gonna struggle to cope with that. And I think while we need to be careful with the whole like electric car, solar PV, own turbine discussion, and also just it's like there's a bit of there can be a bit of a mainland Orkney centered discussion that will not be applicable to the islands because they are even more constrained than we are. And another point added to that is that it's all well and good when you have a detached property in the middle of the fields in Orkney, but if you're in the middle of Stromness, you have no control over being able to put PVs on because you can't. Because if your house is visible from the water, and you can't do it, you don't have any space to put a charger or park your car regularly at the same space. So yeah, that's not really a final point, but I just wanted to raise this nuance. There's a lot of people that are a lot less privileged than the position we are in with all the knowledge we have, that are not able to make those decisions. And we need to be sure that the transition that we have is just for everyone.
Word.
Okay.
Martin Lee.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a point about resilience. In Easter 2014, there was a national grid failure. Everything in Inverness and North was blacked out. The first two places to go back on were North Ronaldsay and Kirkwall, and they went on with diesel generators located in those two places. And that's how resiliency is managed at the moment in getting power back. And for 1982 till 1998 rather, so for 16 years, Orkney ran on a single cable, and Kirkwall Power Station provided all the resilience that was required.
Kirkford Power Station still does provide resilience today, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's still,
Just wanted to make
it's still there. It's got 16 megawatts of diesel generators in it, and it is what provides the backup in case one of the cables fails across the Pentland Firth. And if there is no wind, the Kirkwall Power Station has to run in winter to meet the load.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think these points, and it always happens at an ORF meeting, is you start to get insights into the minutiae of the system that, to my mind, actually suggests that nobody else is going to solve our system better than our own knowledge of it. And I take Martin's points and Evelyn's and Thibault's But if I look down the line at people that are going to make decisions about energy systems in the next 10 years, I don't think we're going to be on their radar. And for all the reasons you just said, Thibault, Orkney isn't going to be looked at because other people are going to be in a more critical situation than us. And that's where the focus is going to sit. So I think we have to be really smart and insightful. And it may end up, Martin, that we keep diesel generators in really vulnerable places because they're the best form of backup supply. But if we're relying on that for 1% or 0.5% or even 5% of the time, that might be better than another solution. But what I'm really confident of is that within Orkney, we've got such a wealth of knowledge from people that have worked in the systems for decades, as well as the innovation side, that we can find really good solutions. And what's really frustrating is that we've offered a system to come and bring us solutions for 2 decades, and nothing's come. And
But if we look at our ferry fleet, nearly every ferry we've got running 3 diesel engines.
Yeah.
When it's running, a couple of main engines and a generator, and we've got how many ferries?
Yeah.
But there's some of the small ones not that many, but we've got 3 largish ones. Finland, Perth got 2 crossings. They'll all be running 3 engines apiece, if not more. So the question I was going to is, the thing that we really need to do, we know what to do. It's no research required. We need to make sure we do not buy another diesel engine. That's the simple answer. No new diesel engine. Full stop. We don't need it for tractors. We don't need it for ferries. We don't need it for lorries. We don't need it for cars. The technology is there for all of those. And we don't use diesel engines on planes where the technology is not quite there yet. But we could ban diesel engines now. 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night.
So then lies the question: if we know what we need to do for so many different technologies, what do we need to do to convince the people in charge of buying each of those things? Individuals, businesses, local authorities. Where do we start? Whose door do we tap on?
Well, my view is the council should start and give a lead.
The simple solution is you don't ban diesel engines, but you have a tax on diesel engines, which you use to subsidize electric engines. So it pays for itself. Whether the council has the power to levy a tax, I don't know. Has it a power to levy a tax on people that arrive on diesel-powered cruise liners? Maybe it does.
Yeah, just to say, someone was telling me Norway do that to tax anyone who doesn't use, because Norway, they do something around cruise liners that arrive that don't use their electric infrastructure. Do you know about this, Gareth? Yeah.
Yeah, I just heard a similar conversation this week that Norway's basically said as soon as you cross the line into our waters, you now have to go on electric engines or non-hydrocarbon engines. And I think James and other people were across from Norway discussing sovereignty or something. Anyhow, we were discussing something, and Norway was saying, well, look, why don't you just adopt a similar harbour bylaw? And he says so many of the boats that come into Norway are coming to Orkney in the first place. They come from Orkney to Norway or Norway to Orkney. So he said, maybe 50% of the boats that you've already got coming in are set up for that because we've instigated the rules. So we're not going to lose anything from that. But going back to what can we do, I think it's, as an organisation, it's having a voice, and at a time of change, it's going back to those pinch points when the politicians are thinking about what to do. That's a really good time to lob some thoughts into the system because you get the chance to influence it. And I think that this is a good time to do that for Ora.
I like to throw a spanner in the works. As a Frenchman, I know what happens when you put a tax on diesel, and that's like a year of people on roundabouts in yellow jackets. Not what? French people. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But there's enough French people in Orkney to go to make them.
it's only a year and a half since they had to use diesel to come here. Prior to January 2022, they could use heavy fuel.
Yeah, so just as extra point on the like, I mean, I totally agree that the a taxation regime would be beneficial, but that is also kind of the kind of centralized decision, blanket decision that is the problem that we need to stay away from, because it's gonna harm a lot of people that we don't really want to harm, that are running 95 reg cars that they can't afford to upgrade because that's just what they have.
I didn't say ban old diesel cars.
Oh no, I'm not. No, I know you said ban new diesel, and I heard that. I'm just throwing a nuance.
And I don't think you should tax the old diesel, the diesel for everything. You'd be far better saying you don't buy any new diesel engines, full stop.
Right. I think probably continue that conversation afterwards, Martin, because we're just running out of time. Mark, did you have one last comment you want to make, and then we'll draw the evening to the close?
That was, well, that's probably now it's still very slightly relevant. When Martin was talking a lot about resilience, it was just an opportunity to say it came across our desk for anyone that's involved with a voluntary or community group at the moment. The Scottish and Southern have opened up their resilience fund that you can apply to get at least 10 grand. Before, people used to buy diesel generators. People are now looking at other and more interesting solutions to use that money. If you can make a case to SSEN that what you do is making your community more resilient, you can apply for 10 grand again at the moment. That's just opened. That was one of the things I was going to come in with back then, and that's probably the best one to finish on, Mark. Hopefully, actually, there's a lot of other ground we covered after that, but it's just probably not the time or the place now, I think. Oh yeah, no, that was the other thing. The other consultation was Scottish Government that they've just. Sorry, yeah, they've just come out on the visitor levy. They are just starting a consultation on how we implement at local authority level, how we implement, if we do implement a visitor levy. And they've just started that consultation running till the beginning of September. I'll put my hand down now.
Very good knowledge.
Yes, right. We're just going to 8:30, so that's the time we usually like to wrap these sessions up. So if you'd like to join me in thanking Gareth and Laura for a fascinating evening of what I'm sure is the start of quite a long journey. Thank you very much.